live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of From the Archives. We're, as per usual, the first 5 to 10 minutes of the live stream is usually dedicated to news and updates that don't make it into the final edited episode of the podcast, but nonetheless end up on the YouTube channel and on the live stream. Go figure. But I eventually cut that stuff out for the final edited episode, which you can go listen to on SoundCloud. So there's not a whole lot of updates other than, obviously, I changed the camera angle. I'm trying this out slightly differently. We're getting into a rhythm now, which I really like, which is, I guess, the whole impetus of it. But we are running into a snag. And the main snag is that I'm running out of books that I feel confident talking about that are in sort of a vein. And we could kind of branch out into all of the books because you can't see it, but behind the camera there are mostly English books behind the camera. And then I've got a bunch of rare old books up here that we could talk about next. My archaeology section, which you can't see, my headphones are covering up. But the archaeology books, agriculture books, education books. We've got large print stuff that's even further down below. We've got even more archaeology journals back here. You can, if I move out of the way, you can see I've got all these journals, and I just don't know if what I'll do is talk about like journal articles. So like all my copies of American Antiquity or Illinois Archaeologist or Pennsylvania Archaeologist or Ohio Archaeologist. I think I'll probably end up doing an episode where I just talk about them as a whole. And the same's true of sort of like similar looking books, and I think that's what next week's episode is going to look like. I'm going to just do all of my dictionaries at once, which I know, talk about not sounding interesting, but I really think that an episode on dictionaries would be enlightening, especially because, I mean, if John McWhorter can do an episode about linguistics and dictionaries, then I certainly can at least talk a little bit about why you should keep a few dictionaries handy, not necessarily one that's brand spanking new. Because that's what I'll talk about with my dictionaries. Oh, you can barely see them, but they're like right here. These are all from like the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and I think this one is from the 60s. But yeah, I like to have a few old dictionaries on hand for. Well, I'll explain that next week's episode, because I think that's another thing that we'll add to each week's tapings. Is I'm going to try and have a book lined up for next week so you know what's coming up next week, instead of trying to pick it out like a day or two in advance. Plus that gets me into a rhythm of reading them, because what I guess I didn't think was going to be so ambitious was I have a lot of books on my bookshelf that I'm like, oh, I've been meaning to read that. Like, I'm keeping it because I want to read it at some point, or I think there's some value in it, but I just never got around to reading it. And so what's great about this podcast is it's forced me to actually read some of these books that I've been meaning to get around and read. The problem is when you record an episode every week, that means you've got to read a lot of books in the span of a short period of time. So I'm trying to pick books that I feel, at least up at the front, are books I feel confident talking about. Like, I remember reading them very well. I have notes throughout them, and they're books that I know, I guess, a lot about. Whereas I don't want to try and pick too many books. So I guess I want to try and avoid pulling books off the shelf that I haven't even given at least a fair shake. I don't want to just pull a book that I'm like, well, it's been on my bookshelf for a decade and I haven't read it. I want to avoid, going in cold for book reviews that way. So that's basically the news on what's going to happen with the podcast moving forward. But yeah, I think that's where we're going to leave the news for now, and we're going to hop right into it. I've got, like I usually do, I have my script in front of me. So if you see me looking up here, it's because I'm looking at a script on my monitor. That's just so I don't trip over my words for things like the intro and things like stats and statistics and whatnot. But hopefully we're going to add a few new elements to this episode. We actually have a recording of the author, so we can hear what the author sounds like. So with that being said, let's get a rockin' and a rollin'. Hello, and welcome to From the Archives, a short podcast where I talk about a book from my library and whether you should or shouldn't read it. I'm Eric, a professor of anthropology at Cuyahoga Community College, and welcome to my library. The books in my library are sometimes old, sometimes rare, sometimes normal, but always interesting. This podcast is recorded live on Twitch at Anthropology Archives every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern. That's Anthropology Archives, all one word, lowercase. During live recordings, I promise to read all questions and comments from the chat in a different accent or voice to make it seem like someone else is asking the questions or talking. Don't worry, if you've missed an episode of the live stream, you can listen to old episodes on my SoundCloud at Anthropology Archives. You can also watch old episodes on my YouTube channel of the same name. Every episode, I ask myself the following questions. Who wrote the book? What's it about? What are other people saying about it? Should you read it? And whether I should can it or keep it. Basically, should it stay on my shelf or should it go? With that being said, let's pull a book from the shelf. All right. Probably very faint today because the last few weeks I've been using much thicker paper, and the paper for this book is much thinner, much thinner. Today we're talking about The Shawnees and the War for America by Colin G. Callaway. It's published by Penguin Press back in 2007. And what else do I have to say briefly about it? It's part of the Penguin Library of American Indian History. So to give you a little context here, this book isn't very thick. It's about 216 pages, and that's including the index and the afterword and the footnotes and all that kind of stuff. So it's not a very thick book. It's going to be a very quick read if you do decide to pick this up. So I highly recommend you check it out. Oh yeah, and this book pairs really well with last week's reading. Duh. Last week we talked about, actually it's right here, so I can just pull it off the shelf. We talked about Indian Women and French Men by Susan Sleeper Smith. So if that book got you interested in sort of looking at Midwest Native American history and especially feminist perspectives, well, this is written by a man, so you're going to get the more male perspective here, especially when we're talking about warfare. But what's interesting is this book also gives you some really good insight into tribal politics and into probably parts of American history that you're less familiar with. But before I really dive into what the book's about, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the author. So the author is Colin Callaway. He has a very interesting title. He is the John Kimball Jr. 1943 Professor of History and Professor of Native American Studies at Dartmouth. So I didn't really look up in advance. I can assume John Kimball Jr. gave some grant back in the 1940s, but why there has to be a 1943, I could not figure out. So if any of you guys know why it's specifically the John Kimball Jr. 1943 professorship, I'd love to know. But he's actually English, so he's not American. He was born in Yorkshire, England. I forget what town, but a part of Yorkshire. Got his PhD from the University of Leeds back in the 70s, and he's been teaching at Dartmouth since 1995. For a bit more context, I went back up. Man, it's hard to read from a script, but then also try to be off the cuff at the same time. So you'll have that when you're trying to improvise, but also follow a script. To back up, which I was trying to get to, is Colin Callaway is a professor at Dartmouth. For those of you that don't know, Dartmouth is a pretty well-known school, Ivy League school, but it's really well-known amongst like people who study Native American history because it is one of the highest universities graduation rates, I guess you could say, for Native Americans in the country, and the highest amongst private Ivy League schools. It was actually chartered back in the 1760s, specifically to teach Native Americans English, is specifically teaching them Christianity. It was a seminary or theological school, which is unsurprising. Most of the schools that were some of the oldest in the country, like Harvard, that was originally a seminary, has started to teach people about the Bible and all that kind of stuff. Dartmouth's not much different. But what's really interesting that I didn't know before I started doing research on this episode and this book is that Dartmouth, I had always just known, like, you know, going to grad school and studying Native American history and archaeology, both as an undergrad and a graduate student, I just assumed, oh, Dartmouth, that's the school that like is well known for, you know, Native American studies, Native American history. It's, you know, top tier in that regard. But what I didn't realize was before 1970, they only graduated 19 students. So in their first 200 years, 19 Native American students. They only graduated 19 in their first 200 years, a school that was chartered specifically with the purpose of teaching Native American students. So I found that surprising. But I guess what's less surprising is that the American Indian movement of the 1960s and 70s led Dartmouth to really sort of change and lean into Native American curriculum and programming. And so they shifted gears in 1970 to sort of recruit more Native American students to promote programming and curricula that were more geared towards Native American issues. And since 1970, they've graduated over 700 Native American students, which, wow, what a turnaround. Went from 19 in the first 200 to over 700 in the last 50 years. So, yeah, they really course corrected there. But anyway, back to Colin Callaway. Like I said, he's from England, so he has this really faint Yorkshire, but like, mellowed out through decades of living in the United States. I actually was able to find a quick little recording, or I guess a short video, where he's talking about a different book. He's talking about The Indian World According to George Washington, or I forget the specific name of the book. But what I guess I didn't realize was that the Yorkshire accent sounds sort of Scottish-like. I mean, it makes sense because Yorkshire is like in the northern region of England, close to the Scottish border, so it would make sense that their accents are more Scottish-like. But I listened to a few videos of Colin, Dr. Callaway, and in honor of him, I'm going to try and do all of the book reviews and any comments in the chat and whatnot in my best Yorkshire accent. So I hope I don't butcher it, and I hope I am not the worst at it. But we're going to take a quick listen here just to see what Dr. Callaway sounds like. So here's a short little video. Oh, and forgive the dramatic, it sounds like the History Channel, like background, sweeping music, but this is produced by Dartmouth for The Indian World of George Washington by Colin Callaway. Oh, I guess it helps if I allow you guys to hear my desktop audio, doesn't it?
Reading American history, back when I started reading it and well up into the 70s, the thing that struck me was the absence of Indian people from that history, so it kind of didn't make much sense. Most of the books I read about George Washington don't say much about Indians, so I thought if I can show how American Indians mattered in George Washington's life at the time when he was creating this new nation, that will help sort of elevate Native Americans into the position that they should be occupying in American history, and showing that they're essential to understanding the early history of this nation.
Yeah, so there you have it. There's that faint Yorkshire accent that Colin Callaway has. I was surprised. I just assumed some guy writing for Dartmouth about Native American history didn't think he's going to be from England, but there you have it. So what is the book about? I guess we should get to that as well. We should get to the meat and the potatoes. What is the book about? Well, the book is essentially a history starting from like the 1650s up until the mid 1800s, talking specifically about obviously the Shawnee, but it's probably giving you a lot more detail. Surprisingly, in about 200 pages, it's giving you a lot more detail than you probably remember learning in, say, like 4th grade when you learned about Tecumseh. Tecumseh does feature in this book, and in fact, he's got a nice little, picture, or I guess a lithograph in the book. But really, he is just one of many sort of historical figures in the book. There's a lot more time spent talking about like Black Hoof and Wapakoneta, which is a town in Ohio, talking about Blue Jacket, other prominent leaders, talking about the history of neighboring tribes. So he starts the book off, interestingly enough, talking about neighboring tribes and giving you a little context of, okay, where are the Shawnee? Where are they located in the 1650s? Who are their neighbors? What are they like? And actually, I think this book does a really great job of condensing down a lot of, I guess, Native American history and politics to make it a little bit more accessible. Like, if you wanted to go read about the Iroquois, there are tomes and tomes about the Iroquois Confederacy and the League, the Iroquois League of Nations. Is it the Iroquois League of Nations or the Iroquois League? But there's a lot of literature on the Iroquois. This kind of gives you like, hey, the Iroquois are neighbors. They don't get along with the Shawnee very often. but here's some, broad brushstrokes descriptions about them. And I guess it gets to the sort of the heart, especially in the first few chapters, of what makes tribal political organization different than like what we're used to. And I think it's a refreshing, different perspective than, say, treating them as like, oh, well, they're tribes, they have a chief, and the chief is like in charge of everything. I think a lot of people think of sort of tribal politics as chiefdoms and chiefdomships, where you have sort of like a hierarchy of power and you have one person in authority, where a lot of tribal governments have sort of this dialectic, or not dialectic, but like this mix of inherited positions because of the clan or the tribe that you're from, but those tribes sort of represent branches of government. So like he talks about, actually, I'll just flip through the first pages here. Specifically with the Shawnee, you have the Chillicothe and the Thawekila. You have the Mikoche, the Pikowi, the Kispoko. And so each of these sort of clans is in charge of a different aspect of government. So like you have the clan that's in charge of war and going to war. So your war chiefs are going to be from that clan. And then you have your peace chiefs who are going to be, petitioning for peace, trying to negotiate peaces, people who are in charge of land claims, sort of think of this as like executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch. You have one that's entirely dedicated to sort of medicine, health, and oral tradition. So basically, the archivists and doctors of the group. So you have like these different roles that each different clan or each different tribe serves. And so it's interesting in that regard. So I'm not saying it's specifically about that, but if you've never even given it a thought about how tribal politics works, I highly recommend you check out this book for that. And this is like $15 on Barnes & Noble or Amazon, so it's really not that expensive of a book. And being about 200 pages, I cranked this out in like a weekend. You could probably do the same. Like if maybe this summer you get a good spot in the sun, maybe on the beach, maybe you're in a hammock somewhere. I will warn you though, it's not a chipper read. It's Native American history, so there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of bloodshed. But I think in the afterword that Colin Callaway writes, which has a very different tone than the rest of the book, but I appreciated it. I reread it last night in preparation for this. I felt like this paragraph kind of succinctly summarizes why, even though there's a lot of heartbreak, there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of violence in these histories, I still think it's good to read them and it's insightful. And I think this paragraph kind of best sums that up. Some people refuse to contemplate such things. Oh, sorry. I said I was going to do my best Colin Callaway Yorkshire accent. So bear with me here. Some people refuse to contemplate such things and dismiss such suggestions as attempts to rewrite history with some kind of anti-American agenda. Many historians, however, insist that it is essential to paint as full a picture as possible of the past and to consider multiple historical experiences. Otherwise, we perpetuate a mythic past that offers little guidance for the real world. History and humans, even in America, have their dark sides. Indians had no monopoly on cruelty, vengefulness, and treachery, and no one has a monopoly on courage and love of freedom. That was a terrible accent, I think, but I think you get the idea. That last sentence there, no one has a monopoly on courage and love of freedom, I think really encapsulates, Colin Callaway's sort of through line for this book, and that's, despite all odds, the Shawnee were, rebellious, resistant, like they were basically the equivalent of, our founding fathers in terms of, stubborn, rebellious, wouldn't let things get in the way of freedom, and they were freedom fighters. And this frames it in a good context, I thought. So let's see, how much time do we have here? Oh man, we're already 19 minutes in. So I guess if I had to summarize this, I completely skipped over some discussion about Tecumseh that I thought was relevant. Tecumseh, for those that don't know, and the Pan-Indian movement, died in 1812, or was it 1814? But he had a brother, the Shawnee Prophet, and I'm really glad I read this before I went to see one of the only dramas that I know of about Tecumseh, called Tecumseh, the Outdoor Drama, which is in Chillicothe. I mean, it's got its problems because, there's brownface in it. I mean, people put on like tan makeup to pretend to be Native American. But suffice to say, it was spring of 2015. I read this book, and then in the summer of 2015, my then fiance, now wife, and I went to see this outdoor drama. And really, I guess the big takeaway is that Tecumseh gets a lot of the spotlight, but I really think Lalawithica is the real, I guess you could say, tragic character, because Tecumseh, his older brother, is what we talk about. His name literally means shooting star. Meanwhile, Lalawithica got his name because he talked a lot. He was a chatty Cathy. So Lalawithica literally means big mouth. And so it's no wonder that he changed his name later in life to Tenskwatawa, which means open door, when he became the Shawnee prophet. But yeah, I would say if you're interested in Tecumseh, you're interested in sort of that era, like a Revolutionary War, American Indian history, or American history in general, this is a must read, because it's going to give you a lot of good context that you probably didn't get in high school, because it was all focused on, say, the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre. I don't know why I'm fixated on Boston here, but you get the idea of it's focused on colonial history and not necessarily on indigenous or African American history. Granted, this one is indigenous specifically. So if I had to rate it, which I did, if you go to Goodreads, you can find me. I'm Anthropology Archives on Goodreads. Surprise, surprise. I don't intend to probably write reviews, because I'm doing a whole podcast episode about them. So, if you go to Goodreads and only see me rating them with stars, then go listen to the episode if you want to hear my full review of it. I gave it a 5 out of 5, and I've realized after reviewing 5 of these books so far that if I give it a 5 out of 5, that means I think this is a book for everyone. It's accessible, and it's a book that I think everyone should read. If I give it a 4 out of 5, I'm thinking probably that means it's a read for most people, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult and less enjoyable. Sort of like it's got good information in it, but it's just not presented in a way that's like, low-hanging fruit, easy to access. Whereas I feel like this, $15, you can get it on Barnes & Noble, read it in a weekend. I think that's like perfect 5 out of 5 material for me, at least how I would rate a book. Whereas if it's hard to get, not as easy a read, less useful information for the general public, then yeah, it's probably going to get a lower star rating for me. And then I guess the next thing to talk about is what other people are saying. So if I gave it a 5 out of 5, let's see what people said that didn't give it 5 out of 5. And surprisingly enough, most people gave this a 5 out of 5, or roughly thereabouts. I believe on Goodreads, the average rating is 3.74 out of 5, based on 192 ratings and 34 written reviews. So there weren't a whole lot of written reviews that were less than 3 stars, and even the 3-star ones weren't really critical or not supportive of the book. Like, the best I can say is, this review by Uncle G. Originally I thought it was Unkleg, but then I realized it's probably Uncle G because he signs off as read by George Wilson. And this is from October 22nd, 2009. Though called the most widely traveled Indians in America, the Shawnees' homeland was in Ohio, an area in which they were pushed farther west and into smaller and smaller areas. On the losing side in the French and Indian War, French, betrayed by their allies, British, after the Revolutionary War, and finally, under the leadership of Tecumseh, defeated for good by the Americans in the War of 1812. Remnants of the nation ended up in Oklahoma. Recorded books, read by George K. Wilson. Yeah, that accent wasn't great, but we're working on it. Yorkshire is not my finer accents because it's subtle. The more subtle an accent, the harder it is to do. And I kind of disagree with him in the sense of making it just so, in the sense of, well, they're destined to be written off. I think Callaway does a good job of sort of counter narrative to that, sort of putting it in the light of, well, it's not a manifest destiny that Americans were going to conquer the entire continent. I think there was another one in here that I was looking for. I have to hunt it down here. Bear with me a moment. Oh, okay, here it is. Jim on April 12th, 2019, gave it 3 out of 5 stars, and he said, well written and very enjoyable. Lots of great information packed into this short work. Afterward, op-ed brought down the quality of this book. And I'm going to have to disagree with Jim on that one. I felt like the afterword, yes, it was different in tone. It was not an op-ed, because an op-ed is just not the right word. It's an afterword. I felt like the afterword kind of tried to take a tone that was like, wow, you just read a book that was really heavy in terms of like violence, bloodshed, and history that you're probably not used to. So I'm going to talk about my sentiments of it. And that's where that quote that I read earlier, where nobody has a monopoly on violence, but nobody also has a monopoly on love or freedom. So I thought that was useful, having that afterword in there as well. As far as Amazon reviews go, there are not a whole lot of them, and most of them are 5 stars. So there's 43 global ratings, 4.5 out of 5 on Amazon. 67% are 5 star, and the 2 and 3 star, none of them are 1 star, and the 2 or 3 star reviews have no written comments on them, so I don't really have anything to go off of. But this one 3-star review by William Graves, disappointing, never really came to grips with the subject. That's, oh, sorry, I forgot to read that in my accent. Disappointing, never really comes to grips with the subject. I'm not sure what he really means by that. Comes to grip with what subject? I mean, it's a pretty deep dive into Shawnee history. So I would say, if anything, maybe he's not coming to grips with the subject, and that there was a lot of violence perpetuated by United States colonists, but also by the British trying to hold back sort of settlers just kind of invading. Daniel Boone definitely doesn't get a lot of positivity in this. Daniel Boone is basically like the devil to Colin Callaway in this book. And rightly so, because there's a lot of discussion about the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768, and basically how, it was this case of, well, the Iroquois claimed Kentucky, the Shawnee were living in Kentucky, so it was like the equivalent of someone selling your house, and then someone moves in, but you didn't know that your house was sold, and that person says, well, I own this house now, I bought it off of so-and-so. Well, they didn't have the right to sell my house. This is my house. Of course I'm going to kick you out or threaten to shoot you because you've trespassed on my property. And so I think that kind of analogy works well for this book, at least in terms of like that case of Kentucky, Daniel Boone, the Shawnee, and that sort. I'm highly oversimplifying. If you want the full details, read the full book. Go out and buy it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever you want to get your books. So should I keep it or can it? I think at this point I couldn't sing its praises any higher, so yeah, I'm going to keep it. I'm probably going to reread this at least one or two more times in my life. I had a lot of interesting notes that I'm sure will change as I get older. As I've known with other marginal notes that I take in books, I've gone back and reread them and put additional margins in a different marker or a different pen just to see how my opinions and thoughts have changed after rereading a book, coming back to it years later. I haven't done that with this book, but I'm excited to do that with this book in the near future. So that's my review. I'm going to keep it. I know that makes 5 books reviewed so far and only 2 that have been, quote, canned, and really only one of them has actually been canned. The other one is mentally been canned. It hasn't physically been removed from my office. It's still on the bookshelf here, but it's awaiting being given to someone. So whoever wants the Chinatown book by Bernard Wong, it's yours. Just tell me where I'm shipping it to, and it's yours. That's going to do it for today's episode, though. On next week's episode, we're going to be talking about Creekside, an archaeological novel by Kelly Carmine. That's going to be next week's read, and until then, never stop reading.